morning and welcome to Dublin City FM. You're listening to our St. Patrick's Day edition of Council Matters. I'm Mick Fitzgerald, and very shortly I am going to be joined in the studio by Stuart Rosenblatt, the man who knows everything about the history of Jews in Ireland. So on that note, I am delighted to welcome as our guest today, Stuart Rosenblatt. Stuart, welcome to Council Matters, and of course, welcome to Dublin City FM.
Thank you very, very much, Michael.
Stuart, we came across the subject we want to talk about when you were donating your magnum opus to Dublin City Libraries. We said we would have you on the show at that day. We keep our promises. So welcome to Council Matters anyway.
Thank you.
Yes. Tell us a bit, before we talk about the subject in question, you're the president of the Irish Genealogical Society. What's your interest in genealogy? How long does that go back?
Well, 20 years ago, soon after my parents had passed on, I decided that I'd check into my family history.
Mm-hmm.
As most people start off, they don't ask the questions before people
That's often the case, isn't it?
pass on, and that always leaves a gap. If only we had asked the questions.
Mm-hmm.
And following from the initial inquiries which I made on my father's side, I decided it would be better off doing my mother's side, which brought me into the Irish Jewish Museum.
Okay.
And the Irish Jewish Museum, there was a lot of artifacts there which hadn't seen the light of day for at least 100 years, and I started codifying them. And I was going backwards and forwards to the graveyard, checking up, and I realised that nobody had bothered to codify the graveyard in Knockabena Road.
That's the one in Dolphin's Barn.
That's in Dolphin's Barn,
Yeah.
yes, the main Jewish cemetery.
Yeah.
Then I discovered there was another cemetery in Ballybock, which nobody had heard about. Well, very few people knew there was one. Not far away from where we are now, in Ballybock.
Well, Stuart, you see, this is where I have the advantage on you. I literally grew up across the road from that one, and so I didn't know there was one in Dolphin's Barn until much later, but I always knew there was one in Ballybock. Yes.
And the question you're going to ask, people will ask, well, whereabouts in Ballybock is it? I think it's Richmond.
No, it's right. Well, it's actually almost on the corner of Richmond Road and Fairview Strand, but it's actually on Fairview Strand. And it's a unique building. You'd almost miss it because it's got high walls. But what always characterised it, and people would notice it as they went by, it said, built in the year 5718, I think it was.
Yes, and that is the Hebrew date.
Indeed,
indeed. That was opened. You haven't visited yourself?
Oh, I have several times. Yes, but here's an interesting story again. A little personal anecdote, Stuart. When I was growing up as a North Inner City hooligan.
Chisler, in other words.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, we were, as I say, we were dirt poor. So going into people's back gardens and taking a few apples was pretty much standard fare.
Box the fox.
Exactly. Yeah, we didn't. This was standard practice. But the only place that we never went in and climbed over the wall was the Jewish graveyard, and I don't know why. There was all sorts of mythology grew up about it. But there was a prince buried there. Turns out that's not true. But it was, for some reason or other, this it was like a taboo within the area, and we were hooligans. We were not frightened of anything, but there was something about those walls that made us wary.
Probably Marley's ghost goes on and touch you on the shoulder.
Well, again, another slight digression. When I came back to Ireland 20 years ago, and I went down to visit it, and the caretakers were telling me that some of the locals, probably after a few pints, got the idea that Jews buried their money with them. They went down to discover it, only to be severely disappointed. So,
did you bring a spade with you?
Pardon?
Did you bring a spade with you?
Oh, I think by that stage they had, as we say, that Jewish people aren't quite as generous in the afterlife, as we say.
They're buried in a shroud. As you came into this life, you go out.
You go out into it. It's quite a different issue altogether. You say you went to the Jewish Museum. What about the National Library? They offer an awful lot of genealogical services, usually to Irish Americans and Australian Irish Australians. Would that not have been suitable for your purposes?
Absolutely not. It is only since I started 20 years ago and accumulated such an mass amount of details from various areas that nothing has ever been done like this before.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about births, marriages, deaths, alien registration, nationalization records. These have never been combined together or attached. They may be fractionalized and separate, but nobody's ever knew about them before.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have what about the burial grounds throughout Ireland? There's 7. Nobody's ever codified them. Yes, there are 7.
We know of 3 in Dublin. Where are the others? There's one in Limerick.
There's one in Limerick. There's one in Cork, and there's 2 in Belfast.
Okay.
In fact, I just came down from Belfast yesterday when I was doing more research.
2 in Belfast.
There's 2 in Belfast.
Okay. Yeah.
And we have 3 in Dublin.
Yeah.
That's 7.
Yeah. To a certain degree, Stuart, you've slightly knocked me off my stride in one sense, because what I was going to say to you, and feel free to correct me on this, is that my understanding always was, going right back to biblical times, that records keeping was very important within Jewish culture. Did somehow or other that get overlooked, or am I perhaps giving too much credit to others, as we say?
Far too much credit. There's the record keeping from the Jewish organisations is absolutely disgraceful.
There we go.
Even the burial records are in a shambles and not even kept properly. They didn't even bother to put the date of my parents passing away in their record book. I mean, it is as bad as that.
Okay, but is it not computerised or anything? Shouldn't, in this day and age of what we call the information age, shouldn't all that stuff be available? That if somebody lives in Argentina but their family grew up in Rathgar, that they should be just able to key in Buenos Aires and get all that detail?
I don't know which world you're living in, but the real world doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
We're talking about, well, at least from 1880s onwards, recently has computerization come into force?
Mm-hmm.
Only the last 10 years maybe.
Yeah.
And the people are reluctant for change.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you have computers, so what? The details are on a disk and they're lost. You need hard copy. You always need hard copy.
Yeah.
And hence, over the years, the last 20 years, I've been produced 19 volumes on Irish Jewry, but there's only 5 copies of each volume, and they are in the National Archives for posterity, in the National Library.
So when you started looking into doing this work, had you any idea of the scope of what you were taking on board?
If I knew then what I know now, I would never have started. No way. It's all started off with an idea of looking after your own family, and it branched out finding other records, as I mentioned before. Then I started putting them into databases. They ended up with 16 different databases, so I was looking up your name. I have to look into the 16 to see if anything was there. It might have been you belonged to the Scouts, you went to a school, or you were in a census form, or you were buried. Well, no, you're still alive.
Sure, yeah.
And these are all records, and then you have communal records which are sent out, and you have pastoral records which are in the various synagogues. That's all information. And you have correspondence and memorial inscriptions sent out, memorial notices sent out to you, and they're all information which has to be gathered into one centre. So with all these databases, a gentleman came along my way and said, all these have something in common, and he came back with what we now call the carousel program. So we have 105 different fields of information. Yeah.
So you've effectively got a relational database in that.
Very relational.
Okay, yeah. That's, as I say, that's hugely important, because if you went back 20 years, we would probably have had a hierarchical one. So even just leaving aside the issue of compiling it, just retrieving information is horrendous under those circumstances. If you, because you need effectively to know what you're looking for. Yeah.
Well, today if you put in a name, the person's name will come up. You have to decide if it's the same person you're looking for,
sure, yeah.
And there are certain clues for that. And then all that information that's been gathered in is entered. And we're talking about everything that is entered.
How difficult is this to do in Ireland? Because my understanding, again, just trying to look into some of my own family, is that around the time of the Custom House burning and things like that, a great deal of records were destroyed. Was it slightly different in the Jewish situation because you did have the museum and you did have other sources, or were birth certificates and things like that destroyed, or how did you get around that, shall we say, bottleneck?
Well, first of all, the museum only opened 20 years ago, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So that was in an old synagogue that was taken over in Walworth Road, because all the other small establishments were closed at the time, and the artifacts were being dispersed, so they decided to bring it all into one place, now with the museum. As for the records in the Customs House, they weren't all destroyed. And obviously now the and there are also fractional records held elsewhere, or copies were elsewhere. But birth, death and marriage records are there from time 1845. We have marriage records which we found. 1844 was when non-Catholic marriages could be performed under license. We have found in Roscommon, of all places 90 miles away, the records of marriages from 1845, and have continuous certificates up to today. There are a few times.
So was there a small Jewish community in Roscommon?
No, but the records were, the General Registration Office records were sent down. They opened up in the depot down there.
Yeah. Let's look at a couple of issues, and perhaps you can nail one of them on the head. If you go looking for Jewish, if you like, relationship to Ireland, the first reference is often the Annals of the Four Masters, or whatever it is.
1100.
1100 or something like that, and it says, four traders came over from the Havre, and we took their gifts and promptly sent them back again. How much of that is a myth?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a myth at all.
Or is it an allegorical story in that sense of the word?
No, I would say there's they came over from Rouen, which was to King Tolerdach, if I recall correctly. He was the king of Munster, and they were merchants coming in from Rouen, which is in northern France, which is the main trading centre. Then in 1555, William Ennis became the Lord Mayor, or the Mayor of Youghal. And then in the 1600s, Cromwell came over, and that's really when the records start coming into play.
You mentioned William Ennis. He was I think he was the Mayor of Youghal, wasn't he?
Mayor of Youghal.
Where did he come from? Was he from Iberia? Was he part of that Spanish-Portuguese expulsion?
Yes, I would say he was a Marano,
who
had come over, and he settled down there. And then over a period of time, a number of his relatives became mayors as well.
Because up until, you mentioned Cromwell, who's, as we say, is a somewhat controversial figure in Ireland, but my understanding is that there were no Jews permitted in Britain until, from I think about 1200 or something like that, for the expulsion, to the period when Cromwell came in, and Cromwell lifted that ban. So was the entry into Ireland slightly easier, or were there people going into Britain but somewhat more surreptitiously changing their name or whatever, Stuart?
Well, I wouldn't say they were changing their name. First of all, there was expulsion from England to Ireland in 1200 because the king at the time didn't want to pay his dues back to he borrowed from the Jewish community. And then 40 years afterwards, when they say expelled to Ireland, yes, they may have been in Dublin, but where they were expelled 40 years later from the domains of Britain or Ireland, they would have moved outside of Dublin to other areas which were not under their control. So it wasn't as if they had just disappeared from the actual country, but they moved into different areas. But they didn't come back in again until Cromwell, because he perceived their business acumen and diplomatic connections very important. Plus the fact they financed him as well. Now there's a community in Cork in that period of time, and in fact there's a graveyard in Kemp Street in Cork, which was a burial ground. It's now a car park. And we know nothing, absolutely nothing about that earlier people that came here.
And what period would that have been?
Well, the graveyard's about 1700, so
Okay.
16, 1700. Then, of course, there was very few Jewish people here. They would have intermarried within the local communities, which brings me down to a point when now with DNA, people are getting these DNA tests done, and they found out, yes, they're Irish, but they have a certain amount of Jewish DNA in their blood, and they want to know why, because you get these inquiries.
Yes, it's an interesting one. You should say that, because we have a mutual friend called Jack Bloomfield, and Jack works in Trinity College, and that's one of the things Jack does. And I was talking to Jack about this a couple of months ago, and he said, yeah, you might be able. He said there is no marker for a Jewish gene, which is an interesting one, because I've heard of a thing called the Cohenim gene. But he reckons that there is no such marker per se. But that's a subject for another day, Stuart. Yeah. Now tell me, Gerald, you mentioned the community in Cork. Now, a very important man down there and a very prominent person was Gerald Goldberg, the late Gerald Goldberg. Now, Gerald used to, I believe, claim, he said, that the current Jewish community in Dublin, leaving aside the last 20 years, he said, could be traced to 5 shtetls in Lithuania. Was he being a bit Irish there in the sense of not letting the truth get in the way of a good story, or is it that homogenous, by and large, the community that's here now?
I like the word homogenous.
Yeah.
I have to explain to me later on.
Yeah.
Yes, in actual fact, most of the Irish Jewish community per se came from a town called Akmenė or Akmean in Lithuania, and there's Telshi, and there's a few other within 20-mile region. Sure. Of course, this all comes from the May laws of 1882, when Alexander II was being assassinated, attempted assassination on his life. There was one Jewish person involved, which who had given a safe house for the insurgents, and the whole community was then blamed for it, and the laws were brought in that for 25 years, children over 12 years of age were being conscripted into the army.
Yes.
And this caused a tremendous upheaval. And so people started to move out. And at one time there was about 1 million people moving, not at all at one time, but they wanted to get to their Medina, which was America. And they ended up in Dublin and Ireland, shortchanged by the captains around.
Well, tell us about that story, because you hear various versions of it, that people got chucked off the boat, or people thought that Youghal was New York, or something along the lines. Share us with even some of the myths on that one then, Stuart.
Well, I wouldn't say they're altogether myths. I would say that they wanted to get the furthest way away from Europe. After all, we're talking about a period when nobody had access to information. They were ignorant peasants. I think they came over with religion when fleas on their back. That's all they carried with them.
And they didn't have English as a first language either.
And they were shortchanged. They got off at Cork thinking it was New York. One man I definitely know got off at Cork, and he ended up in Limerick, and he was there 2 weeks before he realised he wasn't in America. Others ran out of kosher food. Others had children on the way. Others were so sick they weren't going to travel any further. But I did come across a philanthropic society that gave money to people to travel on further. To get on to America, you had to have $5.
Yes.
And so they were given the $5. So they were able to come over originally to get away. Then they stayed for a short while, made a few shillings, and then went off to America.
Yes.
But the records that they left behind, which is very sparse, but if one child was born here, I'm able to trace what happened to them afterwards, because the date of birth and their name will show up in the American 1900, 1910, 20, 30, 40 census. And you're able to see who other children that came with them at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to know about the main, if you like, population centres, which was Dublin, Cork and Belfast. But about 2 years ago, or perhaps maybe 3 or so, when we were looking at the gathering, somebody asked me to look into a community in Waterford. Now, at the most, it was probably maybe 60 to 70 people. I think it was about 30 families. It's pretty much dissipated now. Almost everybody has moved out. But where else would there have been, if you like, smaller? We know Limerick until 1904. Were there other centres that might have had communities, is the best way to put it, Stuart?
The answer is no.
Yeah.
There was a tremendous dispersion of the Jewish people throughout Ireland, and the 1901 and 1911 census will show that. Waterford is a bit unique. They had their own synagogue there, but if you look at the marriage records that took place there, the register is brought up from Cork.
Yes, that's what my understanding is.
That's where the official area is. Now you can pray anywhere.
Yeah.
And a room can be set aside for prayer, and people come down and they can worship there. But you will find that most of the people came to Dublin for the main holidays.
Sure. Yeah.
So they came up from around the countryside.
Yes, well,
but they were dispersed throughout Ireland.
Yes, you'd be pleased to know, Stuart, I did manage to find what was the designated synagogue. When I was taking some photographs, this little lady came along, and she was, first of all, they said, "Are you from the council?" And I said, "No, I'm not from the council." And then I told them what I was doing. And it was interesting. They were interested. And just as I was around the corner, I looked up the census and got a couple of numbers. This little old lady came along and she said, "Oh yeah, that's where we used to go. That's where Mr. Wolfson used to go and light the candles." So I think I got it, but it was interesting as well because it's now the home of a Muslim family. So
really? Life goes on.
Life goes on. But look, let's just show it for this is a volume of what.
Well, this one here is.
Tell us, this is. Yes.
This is my. Excuse me, 10, 5, 15, the 18th volume, Heritage, the A to Z DNA of Cork Jewry. And there's 1,696 individual names here, and with including the birth, deaths and marriages in 1901, 1911 census. But these are the records, what they look like for any one individual.
Okay.
So you have the, no matter what name you look up, it's alphabetical, and all the details about them is there, including their original surname, and the date of birth, and the townsland that they would have come from. This gentleman was from Lithuania, and when they died, and the age, and the cemetery, and we even have row section and plot. So we've done a tremendous amount of background work, and also there are Jewish Hebrew dates, which are being found. And then the brothers and sisters and the siblings and the parents' names are there, so you can have cross-reference.
So why aren't Board Faulty promoting this, Stuart? I mean, this seems like, we do this all the time for the Irish Americans, as we call it, but I mean, we know ourselves that you get plenty of Jewish visitors coming here, and their heritage, they're always interested, particularly the ones who have a connection to Ireland. So perhaps maybe we need to start talking to the powers that be, because we know that when yourself and myself were down at Pearse Street Library, the Lord Mayor was very impressed with your work down there.
Oh yes,
yes,
that was a nice afternoon.
It was indeed. So,
Board Fulcher, you're correct. I'm very bad at the promotion, and I'm going to Seattle.
Okay.
For the International Jewish Genealogical Conference, of which I've been asked to give a talk on behalf of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain Special Interest Group of all things.
Stuart, I've got to do a plug for you. You're doing a talk on 1916. Tell us about that. Yes, that's coming up very shortly, isn't it?
Yes, on Easter Monday in the DIT in Ainger Street. I'm giving a talk on.
What time is that? Do you know?
At 11 o'clock.
In the morning. Yes.
And it's to do with the Jewish input into the 1916 Rising.
Okay, let's just have a very quick look at that before we unfortunately run out of time. Two people who strike me as being quite important that we should look at is perhaps Michael Noyack. Yes. Briefly, Michael, what's his significance?
Well, he was a solicitor who defended many of well, I've used the word insurgents, because probably they were classified as insurgents at the time. Some were as guilty as sin, and he got them off, and he was well known to them.
Yeah. Just because you're guilty doesn't mean you're not. And the other one, which I think is worth a mention, not least because my good friend Dr. Kevin McCarthy has just released a biography of him, is Robert Briscoe. He's former Lord Mayor of Dublin. How important is Robert in the great scheme of things?
Well, he was very important. He was known as Captain Swift. And he went off to procure arms in Germany. And he played a significant part in that area.
Yes. The first elected Jewish Lord Mayor of Dublin.
Yes, he was.
Yes, and a founding member of Fianna Fáil.
Well, I'm not into the politics.
So we're told anyway. So we're told. Stuart, just before we shoot off, where are these volumes available so that people can go and look at them? We know they're in the Pearse Street Library, the National Archives. Did you say?
The National Archives in the National Museum, the Genealogical Society of Ireland have a copy, and of course the Jewish Museum have a copy, and I have the 5th copy.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Stuart Rosenblatt, we've run out of time. We could talk for another while, but you can get some more information by contacting Stuart at Rosenblatt at irishjewishroots.com, or just go to irishjewishroots.com.